There are weeks that change everything. Not months, not years. Weeks, just 7 days. 7 ordinary days on a calendar that can completely redefine a person's future. 7 days that separate who you were from who you become. Most people will never experience a week like that. Most lives don't change overnight. They evolve slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. One decision at a time, one opportunity at a time, one mistake at a time. The changes are so gradual that people often don't notice them until years later when they look back and realize how far they've traveled from where they started. But for a small number of people, life doesn't move that way. For them, everything happens at once. The rise, the fall, the victory, the disaster, the moment that divides an entire life into 2 chapters, before and after. 1 week can erase decades. 1 headline can destroy a reputation that took a lifetime to build. 1 revelation can transform admiration into outrage. And when that happens, the speed is almost impossible to comprehend. The entire trajectory of a life, the entire weight of a reputation, the entire value of decades of work, gone not over years, not over months, but in the space of 5 days, Monday to Friday. This is the story of a man who woke up on a Monday morning believing he was untouchable, a man who had spent decades building an empire that seemed impossible to challenge. His name appeared on lists that most people only dream of reaching. His company was valued in the billions. His influence extended far beyond business. It reached boardrooms, governments, financial institutions, entire industries. People studied his decisions. Young entrepreneurs wanted to become him. Investors followed his every move. Journalists requested interviews. Executives sought his approval. And when he spoke, people listened. His word alone could move markets. His confidence appeared unshakable. His future seemed guaranteed. From the outside, he represented the very definition of success, the kind of success most people spend their entire lives chasing. But appearances can be dangerously misleading, because while the world saw power, wealth, and influence, something else was growing beneath the surface, something hidden, something that had been building for years, a crack in the foundation that almost nobody could see, and like many collapses throughout history, the disaster didn't begin when people noticed it. It began long before that. The warning signs were there. The clues existed. The truth was already waiting. It simply hadn't reached the public yet. Then came Monday. At first, it looked like any other day. Markets opened. Meetings were scheduled. Investors made calls. Employees arrived at work. Everything seemed normal. But by Friday afternoon, nothing would be normal anymore. Not the company, not the reputation, not the wealth, not the influence. Everything that had taken decades to build would disappear before the weekend arrived. The empire would collapse, the admiration would vanish, the fortune would evaporate, and the man who once appeared unstoppable would find himself facing a reality he never imagined possible. But this story isn't really about money. Money can be earned. Money can be lost. Money can even be rebuilt. This story is about something far more fragile, something far more valuable. Trust, because once trust disappears, everything built upon it begins to crumble. And this is the story of what happens when the truth about a person becomes impossible to hide. It's the story of how quickly the world turns when admiration becomes suspicion, when loyalty becomes distance, when power becomes weakness, and when an empire built over 50 years meets the one thing it cannot survive. The truth. Before we continue, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that empires are not built on money alone. They are built on confidence, on trust, on perception, and perception can collapse faster than anything else. Turn on notifications so you never miss a future video. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how everything fell apart in 5 days, we first need to understand what was built over 5 decades. He didn't arrive at the top overnight. Nobody ever does. When people look at extraordinary success, they often focus on the moment of arrival. The headlines, the interviews, the awards, the impressive numbers attached to a person's name. But what they rarely see are the years that came before, the years nobody writes about, the years nobody celebrates, the years spent working in uncertainty, long before success becomes visible. Behind every name that appears on those lists, behind every face that appears in those headlines, there are decades of invisible effort, years of early mornings and late nights, years of sacrifice, years of pressure, years of decisions that could have ended everything before it even began. Years of risks taken when the outcome was completely uncertain, and in many cases, years of hearing people explain why it would never work. He started young, very young, long before anyone considered him successful, long before anyone considered him important. What he had back then wasn't wealth, it wasn't influence, it wasn't a powerful network of connections. It was ambition, relentless ambition. The kind of ambition that people around him sometimes found uncomfortable, the kind of drive that doesn't apologize for itself, the kind of focus that makes some people admire you and others quietly resent you. While many of his peers were still trying to figure out what they wanted from life, he already seemed determined to build something larger than himself. He built his first company before most of his peers were even thinking seriously about their careers. But success didn't arrive immediately. In fact, for a while it seemed as though it might never arrive at all. The early years were difficult. There were setbacks, unexpected setbacks, painful setbacks, deals that fell through at the last minute, investments that didn't deliver what he expected, partners who walked away, people who promised support and disappeared when things became difficult. There were moments when the future looked uncertain, moments when the path forward wasn't clear, moments when quitting would have been the easier choice. Many people would have stopped. Many people would have accepted defeat and moved on. But he didn't. He kept going. He adapted. He learned. He made mistakes and then found ways to recover from them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the results began to follow. His first major success changed everything, not because it made him rich overnight, it didn't, but because it gave him something equally valuable: credibility. For the first time, people who had ignored him started paying attention. Doors that had previously remained closed suddenly opened. The right people started returning calls. The right opportunities started presenting themselves. And perhaps most importantly, he had the instinct to recognize those opportunities when they appeared, and the discipline to execute on them. That combination became one of his greatest strengths. Over the years, the company grew. Then it expanded. Then it expanded again. Markets that once seemed unreachable became accessible. Competitors that once seemed larger became rivals, and eventually, rivals became targets. What had started as a single venture became a growing portfolio of businesses. What had started as ambition became influence. What had started as determination became power. And what had started as a name that nobody recognized became a name that everybody knew. Year after year, the momentum continued. Each success created another opportunity. Each opportunity created another advantage, and each advantage made the empire even larger. By the time he reached the height of his power, the numbers attached to his name seemed almost abstract. Billions, not millions, billions. The kind of wealth that most people can barely imagine. The kind of wealth that changes not only your life, but the lives of everyone around you. The kind of wealth that creates its own gravity, pulling people in, creating loyalty, creating admiration, creating dependence, creating an entire ecosystem centered around one individual. And after enough years, that kind of success begins to shape a person's reality. A reality where people say yes, where obstacles seem smaller, where problems get solved before they ever reach your desk, where criticism becomes increasingly rare, and where the version of yourself that exists in public is carefully managed, carefully polished, and carefully protected. Because at that level, reputation becomes more than image. It becomes an asset, a valuable asset, perhaps the most valuable asset of all. Your reputation determines who trusts you, who invests in you, who follows you, who defends you, and who believes in the story you've built around yourself. His reputation became almost as powerful as his fortune. People didn't just respect his success, they believed in it. They pointed to him as proof that vision, discipline, and persistence could produce extraordinary results, and for a very long time, that belief seemed justified. The empire looked solid. The foundation looked unshakable. The future looked secure. From the outside, there was no obvious reason to think any of it could disappear, which is why what happened next felt so shocking, because the thing that finally brought him down wasn't a bad deal. It wasn't a failed investment. It wasn't a market crash. It wasn't a recession. And it wasn't a competitor outmaneuvering him. It was something far more dangerous than any of those things. Something that had been waiting in the shadows for years. Something that couldn't be negotiated with, couldn't be bought, couldn't be controlled. It was something deeply personal. It was the truth. The public version of his story was almost perfect. In fact, it was the kind of story people love to tell. The kind of story that fits neatly into speeches, magazine profiles, and business books. A story with a clear hero, a clear journey, and a clear message about success. He was presented as everything people admire. A successful founder, a visionary leader, a generous philanthropist, a devoted family man. The kind of biography that gets written into case studies. The kind of life that gets held up as proof of what's possible when talent meets hard work. Students studied his decisions. Executives quoted his advice. Entrepreneurs pointed to him as inspiration. His achievements seemed to support every lesson people wanted to believe about ambition and perseverance. From the outside, the narrative appeared complete. Polished, not consistent, almost flawless. But the most dangerous stories are often the ones that appear flawless, because perfection has a way of discouraging questions. And when people stop asking questions, important things can remain hidden for a very long time. Behind that public version, there was another version. A version far fewer people knew. A version that never appeared in interviews. Never appeared in annual reports. Never appeared in carefully prepared speeches. It existed somewhere beyond the spotlight. Away from cameras, away from headlines, away from the image that had been constructed over decades. And for years that version remained hidden, carefully contained, carefully protected. Protected not only by the people around him, but by the reputation he had spent a lifetime building. Because reputation can be a powerful shield, sometimes powerful enough to make people doubt what they see with their own eyes. There had been rumors before. There are always rumors surrounding people who reach that level of success. Power attracts attention. Wealth attracts speculation. Influence attracts criticism. Most rumors eventually disappear. Most are dismissed. Most never become anything more than background noise. And for a long time, that's exactly what happened. The stories surfaced briefly, then faded away. Questions were raised, then forgotten. Concerns appeared, then disappeared. The machine surrounding his reputation continued moving forward as if nothing had happened. Because when someone becomes powerful enough and successful enough, the benefit of the doubt follows them like a shadow. People instinctively defend what they admire. Investors defend what makes them money. Employees defend what provides stability. Supporters defend what inspires them, and the public often defends the stories it wants to believe. People wanted to believe in him. They wanted to believe the success was genuine. They wanted to believe the image reflected reality, because the alternative was uncomfortable. The alternative required asking difficult questions, questions that could challenge years of assumptions, questions that could force people to reconsider everything they thought they knew, and most people avoid those questions for as long as possible. So the rumors remained rumors. The whispers remained whispers. The concerns remained isolated conversations behind closed doors. Nothing loud enough, nothing strong enough, nothing undeniable enough, at least not yet. From the outside, the story still looked solid. The company was thriving. The wealth was growing. The public image remained intact. The empire continued expanding. Anyone looking from a distance would have seen strength, confidence, control, success. But appearances can be remarkably deceptive because cracks don't suddenly appear. They form, slowly, almost invisibly. One compromise at a time. One secret at a time. One decision at a time. And for years those cracks remained hidden beneath the surface of a story that seemed unbreakable. Yet cracks have a tendency to grow, especially when they're ignored, especially when people convince themselves that tomorrow will somehow solve what they refuse to confront today. And especially when the people who know the truth decide that silence feels safer than honesty. Every year that passed made the situation more fragile, not because the problems disappeared, but because they didn't. The gap between reality and perception kept growing. The gap between who he was and who the public believed he was kept widening, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until that gap became impossible to ignore. What nobody realized at the time was that pressure was building, the same way pressure builds beneath the surface before an earthquake. The same way pressure builds inside a structure before it finally gives way, not all at once. Gradually, patiently, silently. Somewhere, beyond his control, pieces were beginning to move. Conversations were happening. Information was being gathered. People who had once remained silent were beginning to reconsider that silence. And with every passing day, the risk grew larger. The danger grew closer. The truth moved nearer to the surface. But he couldn't see it. Or perhaps he saw parts of it and believed he could manage it. Either way, the outcome would be the same, because there comes a point when the momentum becomes impossible to stop, a point where years of hidden pressure finally demand release, and by then it is already too late. The pressure had been building for years, building slowly, building quietly, building in the shadows while the public continued celebrating the success story, building toward a moment that would arrive without warning, a moment that would transform whispers into headlines, rumors into evidence, questions into answers, and that moment finally arrived on a Monday morning. He woke up on Monday the same way he had woken up thousands of Mondays before. There was nothing unusual about the morning, nothing that would have warned him that the life he knew was about to change. The same routine, the same rhythm, the same carefully structured schedule that had defined his days for years. For someone in his position, predictability was a luxury. Every hour had a purpose. Every meeting had an objective. Every decision carried consequences. And Monday looked exactly the way he expected it to look. His phone showed the usual flood of messages, updates from executives, messages from investors, requests from journalists, notifications from people seeking his attention. His calendar showed the usual sequence of meetings, strategy sessions, financial reviews, conference calls, discussions about future growth. His assistant had the usual briefing prepared, the important numbers, the key developments, the priorities for the day. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared under control. Nothing suggested that this Monday was different from any other Monday. Nothing suggested that by the end of the week, almost everything he had spent decades building would be in ruins. But this Monday was different, very different. Because while he was moving through his morning routine, somewhere else an entirely different sequence of events was unfolding. In a newsroom, behind computer screens, inside editorial meetings, a story was being finalized, a story that had not appeared overnight, a story that had not been written in a rush. It had been months in the making, perhaps longer, months of investigation, months of interviews, months of gathering documents, months of verifying claims, months of conversations with people who had finally decided they were no longer willing to remain silent, people who had carried information for years, people who had witnessed things firsthand, people who had waited for the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. Editors reviewed final details, lawyers examined wording, journalists checked sources one last time. Every sentence mattered. Every claim had to withstand scrutiny. Because once the story was released, there would be no taking it back. Within a few hours, millions of people would read it, and once they did, the chain reaction would begin. At first, he knew nothing about it. He attended meetings, he took calls, he discussed business. He moved through the day, as he always had, confident, focused, certain of his position in the world. Meanwhile, the countdown had already started. Then the story went live. For a brief moment, almost nothing happened. That is often how these events begin, not with an explosion, but with a spark. A single publication, A single article, a single headline appearing online, easy to miss, easy to underestimate. But some sparks land in exactly the right place, and when they do, everything changes. The details of what the story contained don't fit neatly into a single sentence. Scandals rarely do. Reality is usually more complicated than headlines, more complicated than social media posts, more complicated than public reactions. But the essence of it was simple. The man the world thought it knew was not entirely the man he had presented himself to be. There were actions hidden behind closed doors. There were decisions that contradicted the public image he had spent years cultivating. There were behaviors that looked very different when exposed to public scrutiny. And there were people who had been affected by those decisions. People whose experiences had remained largely unheard. People who had watched his reputation grow while carrying a very different version of the story. Now they were speaking, and for the first time, people were listening. By mid-morning, the article had begun spreading beyond the original publication. Readers shared it, commentators discussed it, journalists forwarded it to colleagues, newsrooms across the country took notice. The first follow-up stories began appearing, then more, then even more. What started as a single report quickly became a national conversation. Reporters began calling for comment. Television producers requested interviews. Financial analysts started asking questions. Former colleagues were contacted. Former employees were contacted. Business partners were contacted. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was it true? And if it was, how much more remained hidden? As the hours passed, social media did what social media always does when a major story emerges. It amplified everything, every claim, every reaction, every opinion, every rumor. The speed became impossible to control. Information moved faster than any public relations team could respond. Faster than any carefully crafted statement could contain. Faster than any reputation could defend itself. The story was no longer just an article, it had become an event, and events develop a momentum of their own. By early afternoon, the pressure was already spreading into places that mattered. Boardrooms, investment firms, corporate offices, government agencies. Private conversations were taking place behind closed doors. People who had once expressed unwavering confidence were suddenly asking cautious questions. People who had once offered support were waiting before speaking. People who had once stood close were beginning to create distance. Then came the market reaction. At first it wasn't dramatic. Not yet. The stock didn't collapse immediately. The panic hadn't fully arrived. But something had changed. The movement was enough for experienced observers to notice. Enough for analysts to pay attention. Enough for investors to start calculating risk. Enough for concern to begin replacing confidence. The numbers were sending a message. A quiet message, but a message nonetheless. Trust was beginning to weaken. And once trust begins to weaken, everything built upon it becomes vulnerable. By late afternoon, the first visible cracks had appeared, not in the company itself, not yet, but in the image, the carefully constructed public image that had taken decades to build. The image that had survived criticism, the image that had survived competition, the image that had survived every previous challenge. For years, that image had seemed almost untouchable. Now, for the first time, people were questioning it openly. And questions have a way of multiplying, especially when the answers are unclear. As the workday came to an end, millions of people were discussing his name. Some defended him, some condemned him. Many simply waited to see what would happen next. But one thing was already becoming obvious. The story was not going away. The news cycle had found its target, the public had found its controversy, and the week was only beginning. Monday had delivered the first blow. The ones that followed would be much worse. If Monday was when the story broke, Tuesday was when the consequences began. The initial shock had passed. The headlines were no longer new. The public had already seen the first reports, and now everyone was asking the same question. What happens next? Because scandals don't destroy people in a single moment. The story creates the impact, but the reaction creates the damage. And Tuesday was the day the reaction truly began. Inside the company, the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations that normally focused on growth and strategy were suddenly focused on risk and survival. For executives who had spent years planning the future were now trying to understand the present. The company's board convened an emergency meeting, not the kind of meeting anyone wants to attend, the kind that appears on the calendar without warning. The kind where every participant already knows the situation is serious before the discussion even begins. Behind closed doors, difficult questions were being asked. Questions that had never seemed necessary before. How much exposure did the company have? How severe could the fallout become? What additional information might still emerge? And perhaps most importantly, could the company survive if the crisis continued to grow? At the same time, investors started making calls. Some were calm, others were not. Large shareholders wanted answers. Institutional investors wanted reassurances. Analysts wanted clarity. Everyone wanted information, and nobody seemed capable of providing enough of it. Uncertainty began spreading through the financial world, and uncertainty is dangerous. Markets can tolerate bad news. What they struggle to tolerate is not knowing what comes next. Meanwhile, another shift was taking place, a quieter shift, but one that often says more than any public statement. Partners who had publicly aligned themselves with his name began quietly creating distance. Not dramatically, not publicly, at least not yet. The process started subtly. Scheduled appearances were postponed, joint announcements were delayed, planned collaborations were suddenly under review. Phone calls became shorter, responses became slower. People who once seemed eager to be seen beside him were becoming noticeably less visible. The language of loyalty started changing, and language matters, because words often reveal what actions have not yet made obvious. Statements that once contained praise and confidence now contained caution and hesitation. Words like concerning, words like reviewing, words like monitoring the situation, words like taking these allegations seriously. Carefully chosen language, corporate language, the kind of language people use when they are preparing for multiple possible outcomes. Just days earlier, many of these same individuals would have defended him without hesitation. Now they were creating space, not because they necessarily knew more than everyone else, but because they understood something important. Reputation is contagious. And when a reputation begins collapsing, proximity can become a liability. By Tuesday afternoon, it was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't going to disappear after a single news cycle. The story had momentum. The public was paying attention. Journalists were digging deeper, and the pressure continued to build. That evening, he issued a statement. His team had worked through the night to prepare it. Lawyers reviewed every sentence. Advisors debated every phrase. Public relations specialists weighed every word. The goal was simple. Acknowledge enough without admitting too much. Express concern without accepting responsibility. Appear transparent while preserving as much of the existing narrative as possible. It was a difficult balance, and difficult balances rarely survive public scrutiny. The statement was released. For a brief moment, there was hope it might slow the damage, hope that it might calm investors, hope that it might reassure employees, hope that it might shift the conversation. Instead, it created a new conversation entirely. Because statements issued during a crisis are rarely judged on their own. They are judged against everything people already suspect, everything people fear, everything people are beginning to discover. And when the tide has already turned, statements often do more damage than silence. Because they invite scrutiny, they invite comparison, they invite people to examine every sentence, every omission, every carefully chosen word. And that is exactly what happened. Journalists dissected it. Analysts discussed it. Commentators criticized it. Social media users examined every line. People compared what was said against what had already been reported, and many did not like what they saw. The statement that was supposed to stabilize the situation instead intensified the focus. Then Wednesday arrived, and Wednesday was worse, because crises rarely move backward. They move forward, and once attention reaches a certain level, new information begins to surface. By Wednesday morning, new details had emerged, not from the original investigation, from elsewhere. From people who had been watching, waiting, listening. People who suddenly realized the environment had changed. The fear of speaking was decreasing, the willingness to listen was increasing, and the opportunity to be heard might never come again. Additional sources came forward, additional stories appeared, additional questions surfaced. Each new detail added another piece to the picture forming in public view. The picture was becoming larger, more complicated, more difficult to dismiss. What had initially seemed like a single damaging report was beginning to look like something much bigger, something systemic, something that had existed for far longer than anyone initially realized. And every new revelation created another problem, not only because of what it revealed, but because of what it suggested. People began looking backward, re-examining previous interviews, previous statements, previous appearances, looking for inconsistencies, looking for warning signs, looking for clues they may have missed. Each new detail made the previous statement look more carefully constructed than honest. Each new revelation made the version he had presented of himself appear less authentic, less credible, less believable. The image that had taken decades to build was beginning to fracture in real time, and once credibility begins to disappear, rebuilding it becomes almost impossible. Perhaps the most painful part wasn't what critics were saying. It was what supporters were no longer saying. The people who had once defended him most aggressively were becoming quieter, noticeably quieter. Some stopped commenting entirely. Others issued neutral statements. Others simply disappeared from the conversation, and silence can sometimes be louder than criticism, because silence often signals uncertainty, and uncertainty often signals doubt. As Wednesday progressed, the people around him began making their own calculations. Not because they were disloyal by nature, not because they enjoyed watching someone fall, but because self-preservation is one of the strongest instincts people possess. Every executive, every investor, every advisor, every partner, every ally, they all had something to protect. Their careers, their reputations, their businesses, their futures, and the smartest among them could already see what was coming. The crisis was no longer growing, it was accelerating, and once acceleration begins, stopping it becomes far more difficult than anyone wants to admit. Tuesday and Wednesday had transformed a scandal into a collapse, and the worst days of the week had not yet arrived. By Thursday, the word resignation was being used publicly for the first time. Not by him, not by his company, not by anyone officially connected to the situation, but by others, by analysts, by commentators, by journalists who had spent years covering corporate crises, by industry insiders who understood how these stories usually end, and by people speaking on condition of anonymity, because they weren't yet willing to attach their names to what they were saying. At first, the word appeared cautiously, as speculation, as a possibility, as something that might happen if the situation continued to deteriorate, but everyone understood what was really happening. The idea had entered the conversation, and once a word like resignation enters the conversation, it becomes very difficult to remove. Because people begin imagining it, discussing it, preparing for it. What starts as speculation slowly becomes expectation, and what becomes expectation often becomes reality. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere around him had changed again. Monday had been shock. Tuesday had been damage control. Wednesday had been escalation. Thursday was something different. Thursday was acceptance, not public acceptance. Not yet, but private acceptance among the people closest to the situation. The realization that this crisis was no longer temporary. The realization that the usual strategies were no longer working. The realization that there might not be a path back to normal. The board met again. This time the meeting lasted longer, much longer. The urgency that had defined earlier discussions was now being replaced by something colder, something more calculated. The conversations were harder, the questions were sharper, the stakes were clearer, and for many people in that room, the focus had quietly shifted. They were no longer asking how to contain the scandal, they were asking how to survive it. That distinction mattered, because those are two very different conversations. One assumes recovery, the other assumes loss. And by Thursday, more and more people were beginning to assume loss. Inside that room, difficult realities were becoming impossible to avoid. The company was under pressure, investors were growing restless, employees were anxious, partners were reconsidering relationships. The media cycle showed no signs of slowing down, and every additional day created new uncertainty. For years, his presence had been considered one of the company's greatest strengths. Now some people were beginning to view it as one of its greatest risks. It was a remarkable reversal. The same name that had helped build the company was now threatening to damage it. The same reputation that had once opened doors was now causing them to close. The same figure who had been viewed as essential was now becoming a liability. And everyone in the room understood the implications. After all, he had built that company. His vision had created it. His leadership had guided it. His decisions had shaped every major chapter in its history. His fingerprints were everywhere. Every major success, every expansion, every breakthrough, every milestone. The company existed because of him. At least that was how it had always seemed. But companies reach a certain size where they stop belonging entirely to the people who created them. They become institutions. They develop their own momentum, their own priorities, their own survival instincts. And institutions are often willing to make decisions that individuals would never make. Because institutions think differently. They calculate differently. They ask different questions. Not what is fair, not what is loyal, but what is necessary. And the calculation was becoming increasingly clear. The company could survive the scandal, but not with him still attached to it. For years that idea would have sounded impossible. Absurd even. The notion that the company could continue without its founder would have seemed unimaginable. Now it was becoming the most realistic outcome, and deep down he likely understood that. Perhaps nobody had said it directly. Perhaps nobody needed to. There are moments when words become unnecessary, moments when reality communicates itself without anyone speaking. Thursday was one of those moments. He sat in meetings that day with people he had known for years, people he had trusted, people he had mentored, people whose careers he had helped build, people who once looked to him for guidance, people who once relied on his approval, people who had stood beside him through triumphs and setbacks alike, and yet something felt different, subtle, but unmistakable. The energy had changed, the confidence was gone, the certainty was gone, the conversations felt more careful, the pauses felt longer, the eye contact felt shorter. No one needed to say what everyone was thinking. He could feel it, in the silence, in the hesitation, in the guarded language, in the way discussions seemed to move around the obvious conclusion without directly confronting it. The room had already started making peace with a future that did not include him, even if nobody had spoken those words aloud. Outside the company, the pressure continued to intensify. The media cycle was still moving, still expanding, still feeding on itself. What had started as a single story had become something much larger. News organizations were producing follow-up coverage. Commentators were offering analysis. Experts were debating consequences. Social media remained relentless. Every statement generated reactions. Every reaction generated more discussion. The story had taken on a life of its own, and that is one of the most dangerous moments in any public scandal. Because once a story becomes larger than the people involved, controlling it becomes nearly impossible. It no longer depends on new information. It no longer depends on new revelations. The momentum itself becomes enough. People continue talking, continue speculating, continue analyzing, continue searching for meaning. The machine keeps moving, even when nobody is actively pushing it. And by Thursday afternoon, that machine was moving at full speed. Every hour seemed to widen the distance between the man he had been on Monday morning and the man he was becoming. Just a few days earlier, he had been viewed as one of the most powerful figures in his industry, a symbol of success, a symbol of influence, a symbol of achievement. Now he was becoming something else, a cautionary tale, a case study, an example of how quickly power can disappear when trust begins to collapse. The transformation was happening in real time, and there was very little anyone could do to stop it. As Thursday drew to a close, one reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The conversation was no longer about whether he would survive the crisis. The conversation was about what would remain after he was gone, and Friday was waiting. The final day, the day when speculation would become action and when the collapse that had been building all week would finally reach its conclusion. Friday arrived the way endings always arrive. Quietly at first, so quietly that for a moment it almost feels as though nothing is happening. The world keeps moving. People drink their morning coffee, emails continue arriving, meetings remain on the calendar, traffic fills the roads, the ordinary routines of life continue uninterrupted. And then suddenly everything changes. That was Friday, the final day. The day the speculation ended, the day the decisions became official, the day the collapse completed its journey. By the time the morning began, most people already sensed what was coming. The signals had been there for days. The distancing, the statements, the emergency meetings, the carefully chosen language, the growing silence from former allies. The question was no longer whether something significant would happen. The question was when. Then the announcement came. Not dramatic, not emotional, not explosive, just a statement, a few carefully arranged sentences released to the public, the kind of announcement corporations have perfected over decades. Professional, controlled, precise. Language designed to communicate a major event while revealing as little emotion as possible. Language that sounds calm even when the reality behind it is anything but calm. The statement was brief, almost surprisingly brief. He was stepping down. Effective immediately. The board expressed gratitude for his years of service. They wished him well in his future endeavors. They committed to a thorough review of the matters that had been raised. That was it. No lengthy explanation, no dramatic defense. No detailed reflection, just a handful of sentences, a few lines of corporate language, 37 words. That was how long it took to end something that had taken decades to build. 37 words, decades of ambition, decades of work, decades of sacrifice. Decades of victories, decades of relationships, reduced to 37 words. There is something almost unsettling about that, the way life can compress enormous chapters into remarkably small spaces. A lifetime of effort summarized in a paragraph. An empire closed with a statement. A legacy interrupted by a press release. Within minutes the news spread everywhere. Financial networks reported it. Business publications analyzed it. News alerts appeared on millions of phones. Social media reacted instantly. The story that had dominated the week had finally reached its defining moment, and then the responses began. The markets responded, investors responded, analysts responded, employees responded, every group interpreting the event through its own lens. Some viewed it as necessary, some viewed it as overdue, others viewed it as tragic, but regardless of perspective, everyone understood the same thing. An era had ended, the company would continue, the buildings would remain, the employees would still arrive at work. The products would still exist, the business would move forward, but it would move forward without the person who had built it, and that changes everything. Then another shift occurred, a familiar shift, one that often happens when power disappears. The people who had remained cautious all week suddenly became more comfortable speaking. Former colleagues who had carefully avoided taking a position now had opinions they were willing to share on the record. Industry figures who had remained silent began offering analysis. People who had once chosen their words carefully became noticeably more direct. The protection that power provides had weakened, and once that protection disappears, perspectives that were previously hidden often emerge. Some defended him, some criticized him, some attempted to explain what had happened, others attempted to explain why it had happened. But no explanation could change the reality of the moment. The outcome was already decided. Meanwhile, many of the people who had admired him found themselves confronting a different kind of challenge. Not financial, not professional, personal. Because admiration creates emotional investment. People build stories around public figures. They project values onto them. They draw inspiration from them. And when those figures fall, the disappointment can feel strangely personal. Many supporters found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. Had they misunderstood him? Had they ignored warning signs? Had they believed a version of the story that was never fully true? Those questions rarely have easy answers, and that uncertainty often becomes part of the fallout. But beyond the headlines, beyond the market reactions, beyond the public debate, there was another story unfolding, a quieter story, a private story, the story of one man living through the consequences of a week that had changed everything. At some point that Friday afternoon, he sat somewhere. Perhaps in an office, perhaps at home, perhaps in a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar, a space that was no longer his in the way it had once been. The title was gone, the authority was gone, the certainty was gone. The future he had expected on Monday morning no longer existed. Around him were likely reminders of a lifetime of achievement, photographs, awards, documents, memories, physical evidence of a career that had once seemed permanent, evidence of decades spent building something extraordinary, and now those same reminders carried a different meaning. What he felt in that moment is something only he could ever fully understand, because the most important part of a collapse is often invisible. The cameras don't capture it, the headlines don't describe it, the public never truly sees it. The public story was about numbers, stock prices, board decisions, investor reactions, legal reviews, corporate strategy, future projections, the measurable consequences, the visible consequences. But there was another story, the private one, the human one, the story about sitting alone with the weight of what had happened. The story about replaying decisions, replaying conversations, replaying warnings that may have been ignored. The story about watching decades of work unravel in less than a week. The story about confronting the reality that some things cannot be undone. And perhaps most of all, the story about silence. Because after enough headlines, after enough interviews, after enough statements, after enough noise, there comes a moment when everything becomes quiet, a particular kind of quiet. The quiet that follows the storm. The quiet that forces reflection, the quiet that leaves a person alone with their thoughts. On Monday morning, his name had meant something very specific to the world. Success, power, influence, admiration, achievement. People saw possibility when they heard his name. They saw victory. They saw ambition rewarded. By Friday afternoon, that meaning had changed completely. The same name now carried different associations, different questions, different emotions, different conclusions, and nothing that happened afterward would ever fully erase the distance between those two versions. Because reputations do not simply disappear. They transform, and once transformed, they are rarely restored to exactly what they were before. Some collapses are recoverable, some careers survive, some reputations can be rebuilt over time, some stories eventually find second chapters. History offers many examples of people who manage to return after public failure. But not every story follows that path. Some weeks leave marks that never completely fade. Some events become permanent reference points, permanent before and after moments. The kind that divide an entire life into two distinct parts, the life that existed before and the life that followed. This was one of those weeks, 5 days, one story, one revelation, one collapse, and a reminder that what takes decades to build can sometimes disappear faster than anyone believes possible. There is a version of this story that focuses on the money. The headlines certainly did. The financial media certainly did. The analysts certainly did. It is the easiest version of the story to tell, the most measurable version, the version that fits neatly into charts, reports, and market analysis. The version that can be summarized with numbers, the billions that evaporated, the stock that collapsed, the investors who lost confidence, the market value that disappeared, the financial consequences of 5 days that changed everything. And those numbers are real. They matter. They represent something concrete, something visible, something that can be calculated and tracked. The losses were significant. The damage was undeniable. But the longer you think about stories like this, the more you realize that the money is rarely the most important thing that disappears. Because money is only one layer of the loss, sometimes not even the deepest layer. The more important loss is much harder to measure, harder to explain, harder to recover from. Because what he lost wasn't just wealth, it wasn't just a company, it wasn't just a position, it wasn't just influence. What he lost was something far more personal. He lost the story he had spent decades building about himself, the narrative that organized his entire life, the narrative that explained who he was, why he mattered, what his success meant. The narrative that connected all the victories, all the sacrifices, and all the achievements into a single coherent identity. For years, that story had been accepted by investors, by colleagues, by employees, by the public, and perhaps most importantly, by him. Because the stories we tell the world eventually become the stories we tell ourselves. Over time, the line between image and identity can become difficult to see. The public version and the private version begin blending together. Success reinforces the narrative. Admiration reinforces the narrative. Power reinforces the narrative. And eventually the story feels permanent, unshakable, almost inevitable, until something happens that forces everyone to see it differently. And when that narrative collapses, the damage reaches places that money never can. Because money can be made again. History is filled with people who lost fortunes and rebuilt them. Wealth can return. Businesses can be restarted. New opportunities can emerge. Careers can evolve, even after extraordinary setbacks. But trust operates differently. Trust follows different rules, especially the kind of trust that takes decades to build, the kind that makes people follow you without question, invest in you without hesitation, defend you without evidence, believe in you before they believe anyone else. That kind of trust is incredibly powerful, but it is also incredibly fragile. Years to build, minutes to damage, and once it breaks, it never returns in exactly the same form. It can't, because the foundation has changed. The illusion has changed. The understanding has changed. People have seen something they can no longer unsee. And once that happens, every future interaction carries the memory of what came before. That changes everything. It changes how people view the present. It changes how they imagine the future. And perhaps most significantly, it changes how they interpret the past. That is one of the least discussed consequences of a public collapse. The past itself begins to shift. Not literally. The events remain the same. The accomplishments remain the same. The achievements remain the same, but their meaning changes. People revisit old interviews, old decisions, old speeches, old moments that once seemed inspiring, and they begin seeing them through an entirely different lens. Actions that once looked visionary may suddenly look calculated. Decisions that once looked courageous may suddenly appear self-serving. Statements that once inspired confidence may begin to sound different, not because the past changed, but because the information used to interpret the past changed, and that transformation can be devastating. Because it rewrites a lifetime of perception. It rewrites the story, not just going forward, but backward, all the way to the beginning, every milestone, every victory, every celebrated achievement, viewed again through a different frame, a different understanding, a different question. And perhaps that is the most painful consequence of a collapse like this, not what it does to the future, but what it does to the past, not what people expect from you tomorrow, but what they now wonder about yesterday. What it makes people question, what it makes people reconsider, what it makes people re-examine. All the years that came before, all the moments that once appeared clear, all the trust that was given, all the confidence that was offered, all the admiration that was earned, and all the assumptions that turned out to be incomplete. Because no matter how successful someone becomes, there is one reality that eventually catches up to everyone. The truth matters, not eventually, not theoretically, but practically, because every reputation is ultimately connected to it, every legacy depends on it. Every empire rests upon it. The stronger the reputation, the more important that foundation becomes. He was worth billions on Monday. By Friday he had nothing, at least nothing that resembled the life he had expected to have when the week began. The wealth had changed. The influence had changed. The public perception had changed. The future had changed. And the 5 days in between serve as a reminder of something that even the most successful people in the world sometimes forget. Power is not protection. Influence is not protection. Money is not protection. Fame is not protection. None of those things can permanently shield a person from reality, especially when reality has been waiting patiently for years. Empires built on perception are only as strong as the truth beneath them, because perception can create success, perception can create admiration, perception can create opportunity, but perception cannot permanently replace reality. Eventually, reality demands to be seen, and truth has a peculiar quality. It does not ask permission. It does not wait for convenient timing. It does not negotiate. It does not care how much someone has achieved. It does not care how powerful someone has become. It simply arrives, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, but eventually it arrives, and when it does, the consequences can unfold faster than anyone imagines. Possible, sometimes in years, sometimes in months, and sometimes in only 5 days. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe that someone who builds something extraordinary can ever fully separate what they achieved from how they achieved it? Can great accomplishments stand on their own? Or does the path taken to reach them always matter in the end? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story made you think, take a moment to leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss future stories like this one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and remember, the strongest foundations are not built on success, they are built on truth. We'll see you in the next video.